1943. The North Atlantic. A German U-boat commander peers through his periscope at a convoy of merchant ships spread across the grey horizon. 40 vessels, carrying fuel, ammunition, and food destined for Britain. His submarine has been trailing this convoy for 6 hours, waiting for nightfall, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He has done this before. He knows the routine. The escort destroyers will detect him eventually. They will come charging in. And then the depth charges will fall. He has survived depth charge attacks 17 times. The explosions are terrifying. The hull groans. Lights flicker. Men pray. But the mathematics have always been in his favor. He knows that British depth charges kill submarines less than 2% of the time. He knows that once the destroyer passes overhead, there is a window of opportunity. 30 seconds, sometimes 45, a blind spot where sonar cannot see him, enough time to change depth, change course, slip away into the darkness while explosions detonate harmlessly behind him. This is the game he has played since 1941. This is the game every U-boat commander plays. And tonight, he expects to play it again. What he does not know is that the destroyer racing toward his position carries something new, something that will change everything. Something that will expose, in the most brutal terms possible, just how inadequate the weapons of anti-submarine warfare have been all along. The first indication that something is wrong comes not from an explosion, but from a series of splashes 200 yards ahead of where his submarine is creeping through the darkness. 24 splashes forming a rough circle on the surface, then silence. The U-boat commander has perhaps 8 seconds to wonder what those splashes mean before the first projectile strikes his hull. The weapon that killed him would become one of the most effective submarine hunters of the Second World War. It would achieve a kill ratio 10 times better than depth charges. It would contribute to the destruction of 50 German U-boats in the Atlantic alone. It would help turn the tide in the longest and most complex naval campaign in history. But perhaps its most remarkable achievement was revealing a truth that naval commanders had refused to accept for 3 years of desperate warfare: the depth charge, the weapon upon which the entire Allied anti-submarine strategy depended, had been failing catastrophically all along. The problem began with physics and ended with psychology. Understanding why requires examining the desperate circumstances that produced both the failure and ultimately its solution. Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. This was not rhetorical exaggeration. Britain in 1940 and 1941 was an island nation dependent on imports for food, fuel, and raw materials. The country produced only 30% of the food its population required. Virtually all oil came from overseas. The weapons, vehicles, and aircraft needed to continue fighting arrived aboard merchant ships crossing thousands of miles of ocean. If those supply lines were severed, Britain would face starvation within months. The war effort would collapse. Everything else, the bombing campaigns, the strategic planning, the eventual invasion of Europe, depended entirely on keeping the Atlantic convoy routes open. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, understood this vulnerability perfectly. His strategy was simple and brutal. Sink merchant ships faster than the Allies could build replacements. Strangle Britain's supply lines through attrition. Force the British to divert so many resources to convoy protection that offensive operations became impossible. Win the war beneath the waves while armies remained deadlocked on land. When the Second World War began in September 1939, the Royal Navy possessed exactly one weapon capable of attacking a submerged submarine: the depth charge. This was essentially a barrel filled with high explosive, fitted with a hydrostatic fuse that detonated at a preset depth. The concept dated back to the First World War. A British officer at HMS Vernon, the underwater weapons establishment, had developed the hydrostatic pistol. In 1915, after Admiral Jellicoe requested a mine that could reliably explode at depth. The first success came in March 1916, when the Q-ship Farnborough sank U-68 using the new weapon. The technology had improved somewhat in the intervening decades. The standard British depth charge by 1939 was the Mark 7, containing 290 pounds of amatol explosive. Later versions used Torpex, a more powerful mixture that increased effectiveness significantly. The explosive power had increased. The fusing mechanisms had become more reliable. But the fundamental limitations remained unchanged. A depth charge needed to detonate within approximately 20 feet of a submarine's pressure hull to cause fatal damage. Within 14 feet, It would buckle the hull and destroy the vessel outright. At 30 feet, it might disable the vessel. At 60 feet, it would rattle the crew and perhaps crack some fittings. Beyond that range, it was merely noise that told the submarine it had been detected but caused no harm. This sounds manageable until you consider the environment in which these weapons operated. A submarine in the North Atlantic might be cruising at any depth from 60 feet to 600 feet. It might be moving in any direction at speeds up to 8 knots submerged. The attacking ship had to guess the submarine's depth, predict its movements, and drop charges that would sink through the water at roughly 16 feet per second, while the target continued maneuvering. The mathematics were not encouraging. Even in ideal conditions, with a skilled crew and accurate sonar, the probability of a single depth charge pattern killing a submarine was approximately 5%. Combat conditions, with rough seas, inexperienced operators, and maneuvering targets, reduced that to about 2%. 5 attacks might raise the cumulative probability to 10%. The British would eventually conduct over 5,174 depth charge attacks during the war. They would achieve roughly 85.5 kills. That works out to 1 submarine destroyed for every 60 attacks. But the real problem was not the odds. The real problem was the blind spot. British anti-submarine vessels relied on a detection system called ASDIC, named for the Allied Submarine Detection Investigation Committee that had developed it. Americans called the same technology sonar. This system sent pulses of sound through the water and listened for echoes bouncing off submerged objects. A small dome beneath the ship's hull contained a quartz crystal transducer that vibrated to produce the characteristic ping. When that sound wave struck a solid object like a submarine hull, it bounced back. The time between transmission and reception revealed the target's range. The direction from which the echo returned indicated bearing. ASDIC worked reasonably well at medium ranges. An experienced operator could detect a submarine at distances of a mile or more under good conditions. The equipment produced a distinctive wobbling echo when it contacted a submarine, different from the echoes produced by schools of fish or thermal layers in the water. Skilled operators learned to distinguish these sounds and track targets through complicated maneuvers. However, ASDIC had a critical limitation rooted in basic geometry. The sound beam was angled downward from the ship's hull, but only slightly, perhaps 10 to 15 degrees below horizontal. As the attacking vessel approached its target, the geometry changed in a way that proved devastating to effectiveness. At a certain distance, typically 3 times the depth of the submarine, the target would pass below the sonar beam entirely. The submarine would simply vanish from detection. This was called the blind time problem. A submarine detected at 800 yards would disappear from sonar at roughly 400 yards. If it were cruising at 130 feet depth. The attacking ship would then spend the next 30 to 45 seconds traveling blind, unable to see where its target had gone. Only when the ship passed directly over the submarine's last known position could it release depth charges from racks mounted on the stern. 30 to 45 seconds does not sound like much, but a submarine moving at 6 knots covers roughly 100 yards in that time. A skilled commander making a hard turn at the moment of sonar loss could end up 200 yards or more from where the attacking ship expected him to be. The depth charges would explode in empty water while the submarine crept away to safety. German U-boat commanders learned this vulnerability within weeks of the war beginning. They developed evasive techniques specifically designed to exploit the blind time. They would wait for sonar contact to fade, then execute radical maneuvers, hard turns to port or starboard combined, with rapid depth changes, then go deep and silent while explosions thundered harmlessly above them. The mathematics that made depth charges unlikely to kill became the mathematics that made submarines almost impossible to catch. The situation worsened dramatically in 1940. When France fell in June, Germany gained submarine bases along the Atlantic coast. U-boats that had previously operated from the Baltic thousands of miles from the convoy routes could now reach their hunting grounds in a day or two. The operational radius expanded enormously. Dönitz developed the wolf pack tactic, coordinating multiple submarines to attack a single convoy in overwhelming force. The results were catastrophic. During the period from July 1940 to December 1940, U-boats sank over 200 ships per month. The tonnage lost mounted relentlessly. By the summer of 1941, Britain was losing ships faster than they could be replaced. The entire merchant fleet was shrinking month by month. Trained sailors were dying faster than new crews could be trained. Churchill created the Battle of the Atlantic Committee, bringing together military and civilian leaders to coordinate the response. New corvettes and frigates were ordered. Convoy routes were adjusted. Air patrols were expanded where possible. But the fundamental problem remained. The weapon meant to kill submarines was succeeding barely one time in 60. The recognition that something better was needed emerged slowly from the chaos of wartime research. The man who would ultimately solve the problem was not a naval officer by background. Charles Frederick Gudev was a Canadian chemist, born in Manitoba in 1904, who had come to Britain for doctoral studies at University College London in the late 1920s. He earned his doctorate in physical chemistry under Frederick Donnan and stayed to pursue an academic career, becoming a lecturer and then reader while conducting research in photochemistry and spectroscopy. When war broke out, Gudev volunteered for the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve. His scientific background brought him to the attention of HMS Vernon, the Admiralty, as experimental establishment for underwater weapons located at Portsmouth. His first assignment was investigating the threat posed by German magnetic mines, which were sinking ships by detecting their magnetic signatures and detonating beneath their hulls. Gudev developed a solution called degaussing, a technique for neutralizing a ship's magnetic field by running electrical cables around the hull and passing current through them. The system worked by generating a counteracting magnetic field that cancelled out the ship's natural signature. When implemented fleet-wide, degaussing dramatically reduced losses to magnetic mines. This achievement brought Gudev to the attention of senior Admiralty officials. He was clearly capable of solving problems that conventional thinking had failed to address. In 1940, he was appointed deputy director of a new research group that would eventually receive an official designation that managed to be both bureaucratic and whimsical, the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. The staff called themselves the Wheezers and Dodgers, a corruption of their original title, the Inspectorate of Anti-Aircraft Weapons and Devices, which had been abbreviated to IOD, and jokingly transformed into instigator of anti-aircraft wheezes and dodges. The nickname captured the improvisational spirit of their work. Their mandate was simple: develop weapons that conventional thinking had overlooked, solve problems that regular channels had given up on. The organization operated from several locations, including HMS Burnbeck Pier at Weston-super-Mare, commandeered as an experimental facility where secret weapons were tested against nearby coastal targets. The staff included conventional scientists and engineers alongside more unusual talents. The novelist Neville Shute, who served as a lieutenant commander before becoming famous for books like A Town Like Alice and On the Beach, worked in the department. Stage magicians, prop makers, and special effects experts contribute their skills to developing camouflaged weapons and deceptive devices. Among the department's creations were the squid anti-submarine mortar, which would eventually supersede the Hedgehog, part of the Mulberry Harbours used in the D-Day landings, and various rocket-propelled weapons of varying effectiveness. Some projects succeeded brilliantly. Others, like the Panjandrum, a rocket-propelled wheel meant to demolish beach defenses, failed spectacularly in testing when the device veered wildly out of control before a gathering of admirals and generals. The blind time problem landed on Gudev's desk in early 1941. The theoretical solution was obvious. Instead of dropping depth charges behind the ship, after losing sonar contact, fire weapons forward while the submarine was still visible. This would eliminate the blind time entirely. The attacking ship could maintain sonar contact until the moment of attack. The practical challenges were considerable. A forward-firing weapon needed enough range to reach the target before the ship arrived at the same position. Given that ships attacked at speeds of 10 to 15 knots, this meant reaching at least 200 yards ahead. The weapon needed to sink quickly to catch a submarine before it could dive deeper. It needed to detonate reliably on contact with a hard surface rather than at a preset depth, since the submarine's actual depth remained uncertain, and ideally it needed to compensate for targeting uncertainty by covering a wide area rather than striking a single point. Gudev and his team examined various possibilities. One early attempt, called the Fairlie mortar, tried to launch conventional depth charges forward. It was tested aboard HMS Whitehall in 1941 and proved unsuccessful. The charges were too heavy, the range too short, the accuracy too poor. The fundamental concept of forward-throwing weapons remained viable despite this failure. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Lieutenant Colonel Latham Valentine Stuart Blacker was an eccentric weapon inventor with a background as colorful as any character in fiction. Born in 1887 to a family with Indian Army connections, Blacker had served in Afghanistan, Turkestan, and Russia during the First World War and interwar period. He learned to fly in 1911, receiving one of the early certificates from the Royal Aero Club. He was shot down and wounded 3 times during the First World War while attached to the Royal Flying Corps. In the 1930s, Blacker became interested in developing something called a spigot mortar. Unlike conventional mortars that used a tube to launch projectiles, Blacker's design featured a steel rod, the spigot, onto which the projectile was placed. The propellant charge was contained within the projectile itself, sitting inside its hollow tail. When ignited, the explosion drove the projectile upward off the spigot, eliminating the need for a heavy barrel. Blacker had originally designed this system for anti-tank use. His Blacker Bombard was a 29mm spigot mortar capable of firing a 20-pound anti-tank bomb to a range of about 450 yards. When France fell and invasion seemed imminent, the War Office finally accepted his weapon despite years of previous rejection. The Blacker Bombard was issued to the Home Guard as a desperate measure against potential German armor, though whether it would have proved effective in combat remains debatable. The important point for naval warfare was the underlying principle. A spigot mortar could fire projectiles of various sizes from a simple, lightweight launcher. Multiple spigots could be mounted together to fire salvos. The projectiles could be fitted with contact fuses that would detonate only when striking something solid, rather than at a preset depth or time delay. When Goodeff's team examined the spigot principle through the lens of anti-submarine warfare, they saw a different application entirely. A cluster of spigot mortars mounted on a ship's foredeck could fire multiple small projectiles forward over the bow. The projectiles would arc through the air and splash down in a pattern ahead of the ship. They would sink rapidly toward the target. If any projectile struck the submarine's hull, the contact fuse would detonate the explosive filling. Weapon that emerged from this insight would be called the Hedgehog, named for the bristling appearance of its launcher with 24 spigots arranged in rows like the spines on the animal's back. Each projectile was 7.2 inches in diameter, weighed 65 pounds, and carried 35 pounds of Torpex high explosive. Torpex was approximately 50% more powerful than TNT by weight, giving each small projectile considerably more punch than its size suggested. The spigots were angled carefully so that when fired simultaneously, the 24 projectiles would land in a circular pattern, roughly 130 feet in diameter, approximately 200 yards ahead of the ship's position at the moment of firing. The projectiles would then sink at about 23 feet per second, much faster than conventional depth charges. They would reach a submarine at 200 feet depth in under 9 seconds, and critically they would only explode on contact with a hard surface. A miss would produce no explosion at all. This last feature was both the Hedgehog's greatest advantage and, ironically, the source of its initial troubles. The advantages were substantial. First, a contact fuse meant that any explosion confirmed a hit. There was no ambiguity. If you heard detonations, you had struck the target. Multiple explosions meant multiple hits on the pressure hull, which meant certain destruction. No submarine ever survived a successful Hedgehog attack. The weapon did not damage submarines. It annihilated them. Second, a miss that produced no explosion meant the water remained calm. Depth charges created massive underwater disturbances that could blind sonar for 15 minutes or longer. A ship that attacked with depth charges and missed would have to wait for the water to settle before attempting another approach. The Hedgehog allowed immediate follow-up attacks, dramatically increasing the number of opportunities to score a hit. Third, by maintaining sonar contact until the moment of firing, the attacking ship had much better information about the target's position. The blind time problem that undermined depth charge attacks simply did not apply. The prototype launcher was installed aboard HMS Westcott, an aging W-class destroyer, in August 1941 for sea trials. Full tests were conducted that September with HMS Westcott and another vessel, HMS Enchantress. The system worked mechanically. The projectiles fired reliably. The pattern dispersed correctly. Technical problems were identified and addressed, but it took more than a year before Hedgehog achieved its first confirmed submarine kill. By November 1942, Over 100 ships had been fitted with the weapon. Initial success rates hovered around 5%, only marginally better than depth charges. Something was wrong. The problem was psychological rather than technical. For 3 years, Royal Navy escort crews had conducted anti-submarine warfare with depth charges. Every attack produced a spectacular result. Columns of water shooting skyward, thunder rolling across the waves, the ship shuddering from nearby detonation. The satisfaction of knowing that something was happening, even if that something rarely killed the target. A depth charge miss still felt like an attack. It still felt like fighting back. It provided emotional catharsis, even when it accomplished nothing tactical. A Hedgehog miss produced nothing. Silence. The projectiles would splash into the water, sink out of sight, and simply disappear. No explosions, no columns of water, no thunderous validation of effort expended. Nothing to show for the ammunition consumed. Crews found this psychologically devastating. They had been conditioned to equate explosions with effectiveness. The quiet miss felt like failure even when it was merely an opportunity to try again. Compounding this problem was the brutal reality of North Atlantic weather. The Hedgehog launcher sat exposed on the foredeck where waves and spray constantly washed over it. The electrical firing circuits became unreliable when soaked with salt water. Projectiles sometimes failed to launch, disrupting the carefully calculated pattern. Other times, individual circuits misfired, sending projectiles in unexpected directions or triggering them prematurely. Reports of accidents and malfunctions accumulated through 1942. The Royal Navy had rushed the weapon into service with inadequate training materials and maintenance documentation. Crews received new equipment without proper instruction on its care and operation. Problems that skilled maintenance could have prevented accumulated until captains lost confidence in their weapons entirely. Ships equipped with Hedgehog stopped using it, preferring the familiar reliability of depth charges despite their statistical inferiority. The situation became serious enough that in early 1943, the Royal Navy issued a formal directive requiring captains of Hedgehog-equipped ships to explain in writing why they had not used the weapon against sonar contacts. The Admiralty was essentially ordering reluctant commanders to use a system they did not believe in. What changed the situation was not an order, but an outcome. When Hedgehog worked properly, when crews were trained correctly and conditions were favorable, the results were unmistakable. Unlike depth charges that exploded whether they hit anything or not, Hedgehog only detonated on contact. Every explosion meant a strike on the pressure hull. Multiple explosions meant multiple penetration, and multiple penetrations meant certain destruction. There were no survivors from a successful Hedgehog attack. The certainty was absolute. Training programs were improved. Maintenance procedures were documented and enforced. The electrical systems were redesigned to better handle North Atlantic conditions. Crews who achieved kills became advocates for the weapon, their success, encouraging others to give it a genuine chance. The statistics began shifting in 1943. As these improvements took hold, Hedgehog's true capabilities emerged. The weapon achieved a kill rate of approximately 1 submarine for every 5.7 attacks, not 1 in 60 like depth charges. 1 in 6. 10 times more effective. This disparity was not merely impressive, it was shocking. For 3 years, the Royal Navy had been waging the most important naval campaign of the war with a weapon that failed 98% of the time. They had accepted this failure rate as the natural difficulty of anti-submarine warfare. They had lost thousands of merchant seamen, millions of tons of shipping, and nearly lost the war itself, while using a weapon 10 times worse than the alternative that now existed. The Hedgehog had not merely provided a better option. It had exposed how inadequate the old option had always been. The weapon reached American hands through reverse Lend-Lease in late 1942. Captain Paul Hammond worked with British engineers to adapt the system for American vessels. The United States Navy, characteristically, embraced it more readily than the British had. American destroyer escorts, purpose-built vessels optimized for anti-submarine warfare, began carrying Hedgehog as standard equipment. American crews trained extensively on the system, and in May 1944, one American ship demonstrated exactly what the weapon could accomplish when operated by skilled and confident crews. The USS England was a Buckley-class destroyer escort, displacing about 1,400 tons with a top speed of 23 knots. She was named for Ensign John Charles England, a young officer killed at Pearl Harbor when the battleship Oklahoma capsized under Japanese attack. Her commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton. Her executive officer was Lieutenant John Williamson, a technically minded young man who would prove crucial to the ship's extraordinary success. While England was still fitting out in San Francisco, Williamson conducted extensive practice firings of the ship's Hedgehog into the harbor. He studied the weapon's characteristics, trained his crews to maintain and operate it correctly, and developed confidence in its capabilities. This preparation would soon pay extraordinary dividends. On May 13, 1944, the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, the code-breaking organization responsible for intercepting Japanese communications, decoded a message revealing that the Japanese submarine I-16 was heading to resupply troops on Bougainville Island. I-16 was a veteran boat that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, launching one of the midget submarines used in that operation. The submarine was carrying rice in rubber bags for the isolated Japanese garrison. England and two sister ships, USS George and USS Raby, were ordered to intercept. They departed Purvis Bay on May 18th and proceeded to the estimated intercept position. On May 19th, in calm and sunny conditions, England's sonar operator Roger Bernhardt detected I-16 at a range of 1,400 yards. The hunt was on. England's first Hedgehog attack at 1341 missed. The second attack scored a single hit at 130 feet depth. The third attack at 1410 missed because the crew had estimated the submarine's depth at 200 feet when it was actually at 325. I-16 outmaneuvered the fourth attack. On the fifth attack at 1433, England scored 4 to 6 detonations. These were followed by a massive underwater explosion that lifted the destroyer escort's stern and knocked men off their feet. I-16 was destroyed with all hands. Debris began floating to the surface 20 minutes later. The next day, an oil slick 3 by 6 miles marked the location, but England was not finished, not even close. American intelligence had also decoded Japanese plans for a submarine patrol line north of the Admiralty Islands. 7 submarines of the Japanese 7th Submarine Squadron, designated O-100, and 4, Ro-105, Ro-106, Ro-108, Ro-109, Ro-112, and Ro-116 had been positioned to intercept anticipated American carrier movement. England and her 2 companions were sent to roll up this line from one end to the other. On May 22nd, USS George detected Ro-106 on radar at 3:50 in the morning, watched the submarine dive when illuminated by searchlight, and missed with a Hedgehog attack. England regained contact at 4:25, missed with 1 attack, and scored at least 3 detonations on her second attempt at 5:01. A large underwater explosion followed. Ro-106 was destroyed with all hands. On May 23rd, USS Raby detected Ro-104 on radar at 600 hours and made sonar contact 10 minutes later. Raby conducted 4 Hedgehog attacks. All missed. USS George took over and conducted 5 more attacks. All missed. 9 attacks by 2 ships had failed to kill the submarine. England entered the fight. Her first attack missed. Her second attack, at 8:34, produced 10 to 12 detonations, followed by sound of the submarine breaking up and a massive underwater explosion 3 minutes later. Ro-104 was destroyed with all 58 crew members. On May 24th, USS George detected Ro-116 on radar shortly after 1 in the morning. England made sonar contact at 1:50 and attacked at 2:14. 3 to 5 detonations were heard. Breaking up noises followed, though without the spectacular explosion that had accompanied earlier kills. Ro-116 was destroyed with all 56 hands. A hunter-killer group built around the escort carrier, USS Hoggett Bay, arrived on May 26th to relieve the exhausted destroyer escort crews. But England was not quite finished. As the 3 destroyer escorts headed to port for resupply, they encountered Ro-108. England detected the submarine at 11:04 in the evening on May 26th. Her attack at 11:23 scored 4 to 6 hits. Ro-108 went down with all 53 crew members. That left Ro-105 still on patrol. England and her companions, now rearmed and refueled, returned to find it. What followed was one of the most frustrating hunts of the Pacific War. Ro-105 proved extraordinarily elusive, evading attack after attack through skillful maneuvering and what appeared to be some form of sonar jamming using tuned sound impulses. USS George made multiple Hedgehog attacks. All missed. USS Raby attacked repeatedly, all missed. Over 25 hours, the three ships conducted more than 20 Hedgehog attacks without success. Commander Hamilton Haines, the division commander, had been deliberately keeping England out of the fight, wanting to give the other ships a chance to score their own kills. Finally, at dawn on May 31st, with row 105 still alive after enduring everything his other ships could throw at it, Haines made a decision that would become famous. He radioed, "Oh hell, go ahead England." England's attack at 7:36 produced 6 to 10 detonation. A major explosion followed at 7:41. Oil and debris erupted to the surface. Row 105 was destroyed with all 55 hands, including Captain Ryanosuke Kata, the commander of Japanese Submarine Division 51, who had been riding aboard as an observer. 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days. All by a single ship using Hedgehog. This record has never been equaled in the history of anti-submarine warfare. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, sent a message to England's crew: "There will always be an England in the United States Navy." His pledge was honored in 1963, when a guided missile frigate received the name. Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison, the official historian of United States Naval Operations, reported that Commander Haines had radioed England after one of her kills asking how the hell they did it. The response from Commander Thorwall, riding aboard England as commander of Destroyer Escort Division 40, combined technical explanation with dark humor about Japanese submariners joining their honorable ancestors. The transformation in Atlantic warfare was equally dramatic, though distributed across many ships rather than concentrated in one extraordinary vessel. May 1943 became known as Black May, the month when the U-boat offensive finally broke. 41 German submarines were destroyed that month, more than in all previous months combined. The crisis that had peaked in March, when U-boats sank 120 ships, totaling nearly 700,000 tons, collapsed within weeks. Allied losses dropped precipitously. By summer, the convoy routes were effectively secure. Multiple factors contributed to this reversal. Improved centimetric radar that U-boats could not detect. Long-range Liberator aircraft that closed the mid-Atlantic gap where no air cover had previously been available. Intelligence breakthroughs that allowed convoys to route around U-boat patrol lines. Better tactical coordination through support groups that could reinforce threatened convoys. The closing of the air gap through escort carriers that provided continuous overhead protection. But among the weapons that made the difference, Hedgehog and its successor, Squid, stand out for what they revealed as much as what they accomplished. The principle that forward-throwing weapons with contact fuses outperform stern-dropped weapons with depth fuses seems obvious in retrospect. The blind time problem had been recognized since the beginning of the war. The mathematics of depth charge ineffectiveness were available to anyone who examined the statistics honestly. Yet the Royal Navy had resisted change for years. Admirals who had grown up with depth charges trusted depth charges. The satisfying explosion of a miss felt more like warfare than the disappointing silence of a Hedgehog failure. Tradition and psychology trumped logic and evidence until the evidence became impossible to ignore. If you are finding this valuable, a subscription helps more than you know. Now let me explain why this matters beyond military history. The Hedgehog story illustrates a principle that appears across many fields. Sometimes the greatest improvement comes not from making existing methods better, but from recognizing that existing methods were worse than anyone wanted to admit. Consider the depth charge for a moment. It was not a bad weapon in the sense of being poorly designed. It worked exactly as intended. The explosive detonated at the preset depth. The hydrostatic fuse functioned reliably. The manufacturing quality was consistent. By every internal measure, the depth charge was a success. Yet measured against its actual purpose, killing submarines, it failed 98% of the time. The weapon worked perfectly. The strategy employing it was nearly useless. This distinction matters because organizations tend to measure what they can measure rather than what they should measure. Depth charges produced explosions. Explosions could be counted, photographed, reported up the chain of command. The satisfying thunder of detonations felt like progress. No one wanted to dwell on the uncomfortable question of whether those detonations accomplished anything. The Hedgehog forced that question into the open. Its silent misses provided no false comfort. Its confirmed hits provided undeniable evidence. The weapon measured what mattered: actual submarine kills, rather than what felt satisfying, impressive explosions. One submarine killed for every 60 attacks, versus one submarine killed for every 6 attacks. That comparison said everything that needed to be said. 3 years of confident doctrine collapsed under the weight of 2 simple numbers. The German U-boat commanders who survived the war later described the terror of Hedgehog attacks. With depth charges, they knew the rules: evade during the blind time, go deep, endure the thunder, wait for silence, and then creep away. The system was frightening but predictable. The odds favored survival. With Hedgehog, the rules changed completely. There was no blind time to exploit. There was no thunder to endure unless that thunder meant death. The first indication that an attack had failed was simply silence. The first indication that an attack had succeeded was oblivion. No survivor ever reported what a successful Hedgehog attack felt like from inside the target submarine. The weapon offered no opportunity for endurance. You simply waited to learn whether you would live or die, with no warning either way. The mathematical elegance of the Hedgehog's success deserves appreciation. 24 projectiles landing in a circle 130 feet in diameter. A German Type 7 U-boat was roughly 220 feet long and 20 feet wide. The Japanese Row 100 class submarines that USS England hunted were approximately 200 feet long. If the center of the Hedgehog pattern landed anywhere on the submarine, multiple projectiles would strike the hull. The combination of pattern size and submarine dimensions meant that precision targeting was unnecessary. Getting close was enough, and maintaining sonar contact until the moment of firing meant getting close was achievable. Compare this to depth charges, where the attacking ship had to guess not only the horizontal position but also the vertical depth of a moving target, then drop. Weapons that would take 15 to 30 seconds to sink to the estimated explosion point, while the target continued maneuvering in 3 dimensions. The depth charge was trying to solve a harder problem with less information. The Hedgehog was solving an easier problem with more information. This was not because submarines had changed. It was because some had finally realized that the problem needed to be reframed. Today, the descendants of both weapons have been largely replaced by homing torpedoes and sophisticated sensor systems. Modern anti-submarine warfare involves technologies that would seem like science fiction to the sailors of 1943. But the fundamental principle established by the Hedgehog remains embedded in naval doctrine. Attack while you can see the target. Maintain contact until the moment of impact. Do not surrender information for tradition. Charles Goodhue survived the war and went on to a distinguished career in industrial research and operations research. He helped establish the Operational Research Society and worked to extend analytical methods to social problems. He was knighted in 1946 for his wartime contributions. He died in 1980. Stuart Blacker, whose spigot mortar concept made the Hedgehog possible, received £32,000 from the Royal Commission on Award to inventors for his contributions to multiple weapons systems including the Hedgehog, the Piat anti-tank weapon, and other devices. He retired from the Territorial Army in October 1942 and died in 1964. The Wheezers and Dodgers were disbanded after the war, their improvisational approach absorbed into more conventional research structures, but their legacy lived on in the weapons they created and the problems they solved when conventional thinking had failed. The Hedgehog itself continued in service for decades. The United States Navy kept it operational through the 1960s, deploying it aboard vessels in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The basic principle of forward-throwing anti-submarine weapons evolved into more sophisticated systems like Squid, which used a 3-barreled mortar and could set depth automatically based on sonar information, and Limber, which remained in Commonwealth navies into the 1980s. Eventually homing, torpedoes and rocket-delivered weapons superseded all contact-fused mortars. A few Hedgehog launchers survive in museums, their spigots still arranged in rows like the weapon's namesake. The National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington displays one. The USS Slater, a preserved destroyer escort in Albany, New York, maintains another aboard ship. They look almost primitive now, simple steel tubes mounted on a rotating platform. Nothing about their appearance suggests the revolution they represented, or the lives they saved. But those simple steel tubes asked a question that 3 years of warfare had failed to ask. What if the standard approach was not working? What if the satisfying explosions were accomplishing nothing? What if the weapon everyone trusted was the reason the battle was being lost? The answers transformed the longest campaign of the Second World War. The Hedgehog did not make depth charges 10 times less effective. Depth charges had always been that ineffective. The statistics had been available from the beginning. The mathematics of blind time and sinking rates and target geometry all pointed toward the same conclusion. But no one wanted to draw that conclusion because it meant admitting that standard practice was failing. The Hedgehog simply made that truth impossible to ignore. In the shadow war beneath the Atlantic waves, where survival depended on split-second decision and accumulated probabilities, that truth cost lives every day it remained hidden. Merchant sailors died in torpedoed ships while escort crews dropped depth charges that accomplished nothing. U-boat commanders survived attack after attack while naval officers congratulate themselves on the number of explosions they had produced. And that truth saved lives every day after it was finally acknowledged. Every submarine killed by Hedgehog was a submarine that would never torpedo another convoy. Every U-boat commander who learned to fear the silent splashes was a commander whose confidence had been shaken, whose aggressive instincts had been blunted, because in warfare, as in so many other domains, the most dangerous assumption is often the one that feels most comfortable. The assumption that because something is familiar, it must be working. The assumption that because something produces visible results, it must be producing the right results. The assumption that questioning standard practice is more dangerous than defending it. The men who developed the Hedgehog questioned standard practice. The commanders who finally embraced it acknowledged that questioning was necessary. And the submarines resting on the ocean floor, destroyed by a weapon their commanders never expected, stand as permanent testimony to what that questioning achieved.